Okay, you're good.
Sorry.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to staff meeting today for October 22nd, 2024. Manager Stoltz, take it away.
Good morning, Commission Chairman. We have talked a lot the last 2 years about sales tax, property tax, and the relationship within the county budget on how those are managed. And Lindsay will take this over in just a second, but we've said it many times that money within Sedgwick County is fungible. That means it can go from account to account, and the commission has latitude on how to spend that money. We have a lot of discussion in the community today about a sales tax in lieu of property tax, something additional with the cities or just with the county. That discussion is ongoing. That is not what we are going to discuss today. What we want to discuss today is an idea that we have talked about for a year or two at least, where we take inside the county budget, the sales tax that we receive every year from our percentage of a penny, which is roughly 40 million, half of which goes to Lynn at Public Works for streets and bridges. And the other half comes into county general fund to pay for whatever the commission needs it to pay for. The discussion is to dedicate that other 19 million or 20 million that comes into county general fund to arts and culture, dedicate it to that, and then use property tax money for core services. So that's the discussion of today. Lindsay gave me a little bit of a head nod, so she'll come clean this up a little bit, I'm sure. But that was my intention of coming in today, so we get some clarity from commission on how they want to go. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Okay, so commissioners, you have a packet in front of you. The first document is a revised resolution that is slightly different than what had been sent around before. So as Tom said, we've been talking about this for a while. For this particular resolution, just a quick recap of the history. Commissioner Howell had brought this up during the budget process because it didn't tie specifically to the 2025 budget, but was more of a global nature. We pushed it off to the very first commission meeting after budget adoption. So at your, I think it was September 4th meeting, this resolution came up. At that time, it looked a little different. In our 221s that we'd had, they weren't scheduled specifically for this. I think we were actually talking about the sale of a sheriff airplane in those 221s, but we happened to have an opportunity to talk about this resolution. Generally, there were concerns brought up by multiple commissioners through that. And then talking with Commissioner Howell after that, Tom Henry in legal was able to make some updates to the resolution that had otherwise been proposed. So at that commission meeting on September 4th, what you all talked about very briefly was this idea that we would have what's Commissioner Howell has called a property tax check valve. So it's not necessarily that we would dedicate half of the dollars to quality of life, but we would never exceed that half on quality of life type expenditures. So the rest of your packet includes some information on what that list would include that's specifically spelled out in this resolution. So I want to give Commissioner Howell an opportunity to talk about it, but real quick, I just wanted to say why we're having this today is because at that September 4th meeting, the directive from commissioners was to staff this, then give an opportunity for this to be run by your cabs, if that was your decision. And then to come back on November 13th to have this conversation and have a vote on this resolution. So this is the first staff. Then if you have your cabs, if the commission will is to have that conversation, we'll figure out the appropriate staff to go have that conversation, get feedback, bring back hopefully to another staff meeting on November 12th to then have this on the 13th. So sorry for a lot of words, but that's kind of how we got where we are. And now I guess Commissioner Howell, I'll turn it over to you to talk about what your objective is here and how you would see this working, if that's okay.
And I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. So as a manager described this initially, I would disagree with a little bit with a couple of things you said there. Just want to make sure we're clear. This is not to dedicate sales taxes to only quality of life. The intent of this is to limit property taxes to core functions. And I want to say it that way intentionally. So what this is, this provides a guideline to ourselves as well as to our staff and to the community. It says if we're going to consider some type of spending for something that's not a non-core function of government, it's got to be funded through sales tax, existing sales tax. And again, there's a zero sum game of dollars there that says it can be spent for those things, but there's a limit. And I think I would differentiate, the items on this third page here, or even the second page. The question is, are we willing to raise property taxes to fund some of these things? If it came right down to it, would we raise property taxes to fund, for example, Sedgwick County Fair? I would argue we would not. So Sedgwick County Fair is a nice thing to have. It's a nice thing to do. It should be funded through sales tax. So I'll use that one as an easy one to deal with. Would we raise property taxes to fund the sheriff? Absolutely. There's no question we would do that. Would we raise property taxes to fund the manager's office? If we need to do that, of course we would do that. That's a core function of government. Core functions of government include things like human resources, our training, a manager's office, I think communications, finance, purchasing. Those are all things we have to do. That helps us operate as an organization. Fleet management is a great example. Obviously, our services, things like Sedgwick County Jail, the court system, forensic science. These are all things that arguably are core functions of government. Emergency management. We can just go on and on. 911. There's all kinds of things that get parts of their funding or all of their funding through property taxes. And to the extent there's a shortage of dollars available on the property tax side, we would be compelled to raise the mill levy to provide the funding necessary to run those core functions of government. The items on this third list here, this third page here, Oakland Transit. It's a nice thing to do, but if we had to cut the budget, we've actually talked about this last year. It was up for discussion whether or not that would be cut because it's not a core function of government. Specialty courts, I think that's a great thing to do if we have the money, but that's something we should do through sales tax. On it goes. So there's a lot of things on this list that I think are good things. They enhance quality of life. They're discretionary, and I would not be willing to raise property taxes to fund them. So therein lies the difference. So if I knock on someone's door, I talk to a constituent in the community, I say, property taxes are for funding core functions of government. And a lot of times, especially the legislature, they'll come back and say, yeah, but you guys do this and you guys do that. You guys give money to parks. You guys give money to, the zoo or exploration place or whatever. That's what they usually say. They'll name those two things. And and the answer is because the money is mingled within the general fund. In a sense, we don't know what dollars go to what source of dollars goes to what function. All this does is clarifies that property taxes cannot be used for those quality of life functions of government. We reserve those core functions to property taxes. Now, what that means is if let's say we went by either one of these lists and there's a surplus of funds left over, and we have a choice then. We can either use that money for property tax relief. Again, sales taxes can still be used for property tax relief. Sales taxes can be used to fund core functions. I'm not prohibiting that sales taxes cannot be used for core functions. I'm not saying that at all. All I'm saying is property taxes cannot be used for discretionary quality of life, non-core functions of government. Now, a couple caveats here. Sedgwick County Zoo, we have employees that we have to pay for. So out of the sales tax funds, you pay for them first. And to the extent there's revenue available to pay for the employees at the zoo, you pay for them first. It's a first fund out of the sales tax revenue. And then you pay anything else that's, again, that is essentially, I say is less discretionary within the quality of life fund, quality of life spending. There may be a few other things that are like that, but then you get over to basically simply a discretionary choice of the board here. We can choose to fund it or not fund it. Ultimately, I don't want to say that we have to spend this money in these areas. I would like to have 5 million left over or some portion of that money left over to go back to property tax relief on the core function side of the general fund. But again, all this does is it gives us a guideline. It gives staff some direction. It tells the public what we're willing to consider. And if we find out there's more things to fund out of the sales tax funds than there's dollars for, we have to make hard decisions. You have to cut something here to fund something there. It's almost like a pay-go theory within the sales tax dollars. And there is a limit to what we would spend those dollars on. We have to, once you run out of money, you have to stop spending money. Right now, we don't think that way. And I think we need to think that way. Another thing is I'd say, and I'm not sure it's clear in the resolution, but this is a resolution that can be rescinded. So we're not binding future commissioners. If they don't want to live by this rule, they can change the rule. Also, I think notwithstanding the resolution, this is a guideline. Does it say that we could never appropriate core function, I should say, property tax dollars or something that's on the other side of the equation? I don't know that it prohibits it necessarily, or does it? Maybe I'm wrong about prohibition, whether or not we as a board would have the discretion to say, notwithstanding this resolution, make an exception. And I don't know that that's a good legal question. I'm not sure.
I'll defer to Justin or Tom Henry on if this is.
Could you rephrase the question there?
So let's just say that we find something really compelling that we want to do with property tax dollars that it's desired but not required. It's not a core function. And there's not dollars in the sales tax funds to fund it. Do we have the discretion to say, notwithstanding this resolution, we would make an exception? Now, again, I think this gives us a backup, says it gives us, the commissioners, the right to vote no on that idea. Gives staff the reason to recommend a no vote. It gives staff direction, gives the community some framework to, if they shouldn't be asking us for money that is not available. So this is a guideline for the public. It's a guideline for staff. It's certainly a guideline for commissioners. It gives us a reason to vote no for something because there's not funding available. Notwithstanding the resolution, we might make an exception in some case. Is this a hard lid or is this a soft lid?
Right. So similarly to future commission's ability to rescind this, if there is a one-off situation where you want to exceed that cap, the commission would have the ability to do that with a vote to, I guess, essentially not adhere to or abide by this resolution.
So I would encourage us not to lean on that too hard. I'd say, generally speaking, I would really like us not to do that, but you don't know every situation that's going to come up. We don't know what we don't know. And so is it saying we'd have to rescind the resolution before we could consider something that's extraordinarily important or desired by the commission? No, we could jump over this. This is a guideline for public, guideline for staff, guideline for commissioners. Gives us a reason to vote no. When you run out of money, you stop spending money. If you want to spend money for something that there's not money in the sales tax funds, you got to cut something else from the sales tax funds to fund it. That's how we should operate. I'm not suggesting we spend $19 million on these types of spending. I'm suggesting that that's where the source of funding comes from. And ideally, there'd be money left over that would still go over to the property tax side to offset property tax dependency. We see some reduction in property tax from sales tax. So sales tax funds some core functions. I'm not suggesting that can't happen. So I'm not saying you have to spend $19 million on discretionary quality of life stuff. I'm simply saying that you can't use property tax dollars to fund these types of spending. And that's what this is trying to do. I'll stand for questions. Thank you.
Commissioner, appreciate that. I do have a couple questions. One is we have a couple of different supporting documents here. We have one that has 22 items listed, and then one that is binding to this resolution only has 11 departments or centers or organizations. How did we arrive to this list comparative to this list? Was there any thought? Can maybe give me some highlights as to what the thought was with that?
Well, first, let me explain this table, which is the third in your packet. So this was generated through 2024 budget conversations. So a year and a half ago, we started talking about what's discretionary, what we could truly call as discretionary spending on the general fund side of things, as we were trying to define core and not core as the commission was trying to go through a budget process. So that's where this list came from originally. When it was originally created, it was also tied to mill levy. So that you all could have some context. So this simply just brings that list forward. What you have on, you're right. This other sheet, the second one in your packet, is tied specifically to this resolution. And my understanding is this is the list of items, as Commissioner Howell mentioned, that he thought were truly quality of life, not just discretionary. And so I think this resolution focuses on those quality of life things as opposed to discretionary funding. So we have talked about both lists in the past. That's why I wanted to give them both to you so that we could have some clarity. One is discretionary, one is quality of life. And so this one is also then built to have some qualifying notes in it, your middle section, that talks about some of, in the last 5 years, some of the more extraordinary things that have happened or just some context. And then the final section here gives you some idea of what property taxes have looked like the last few years. I'll just remind commissioners that in the most recent monthly report that I sent you and the quarterly report that you will see soon, we have actually been lagging in sales tax collections up until this last month. September distributions actually brought us up to $1,000 more collected year to date versus the same time last year. So we're almost flat. Now, I'm going to tell you that comes with some bad news, and that's a 2-month lag. And since then, we know that we've had the Textron strikes, and we know that we have some Spirit furloughs coming up. That is going to absolutely, without a doubt, impact retail spending. And so I don't expect this to get much better this year. It will probably stay relatively flat. So that's just something to keep in mind is as you go forward. That's why it's also really important that this resolution ties back to actual collections and not estimated, because who could have seen a Textron strike or Spirit furloughs coming a year ago when we planned this budget? So,
Yeah.
sorry, more
well,
than you asked for.
No, it's good. From context, if you talk about a down year, an economic year, a recession, what percentage would you anticipate seeing 30, 40, 50% reduction in sales tax? I mean, I'm a retailer, so I'm having a down year too, but it's not 10, 12, 15, 30%. So I see a gap here of $5 million between what what 2023 collection is compared to what the quality of life spending is. I have a hard time believing that we're ever going to dip below that 13, 14.
No, I agree. I think even at the height of the recession, in 2010, 2011, we saw about an 8% decrease overall. And the world has changed since then, because now we're able to collect more use tax on Amazon sales or online sales. That did not happen then. We don't have any kind of guidepost at this point to tell us what to anticipate, because the rules have changed since then.
So question, and this might be just a matter of opinion, but we kind of need this to forecast a little bit. So if we're looking at $14.3 million here that is funded in the quality of life departments, you don't have any fear that even on a reduction or on a down year, an economic slide, that what we are trying to designate for our sales tax piece of that 1 cent sales tax. I'm sorry, let me back up. The 50% piece of the 1 cent sales tax, you don't have any fear that that's not going to be able to cover these investments, do you?
But I don't. I think the part that gives me a lot of comfort with that is this highlighted portion in section 1 of the resolution that specifically says capital improvement spending on Sedgwick County owned property shall not be considered quality of life spending, because as is noted here, you all have just approved in the 2025 budget a parks master plan. There are millions of dollars worth of requested projects at this moment sitting on the watch list, and we don't know what that master plan is going to come back with. So once that happens, or if the zoo has significant repairs, I mean, it's our infrastructure, right? So if something needs to happen, we need to be able to respond to that. This gives me the comfort that even though we could exceed potentially in 1 year the 13.8 million that's budgeted in 2025, we could exceed the 19.5 million once you add in capital projects, because those capital projects aren't tied to this any longer. That gives me a lot more comfort.
Okay. I'll just tell you kind of my view is, I know some of this is seen because of the fluidity of funding and the fungibility, if that's even a word. I think some of this is seen as semantics, and I understand that. The inverse of that is also true. If it's just semantics, I don't see this as too big of a deal. If it's just semantics. For me, this is an issue of consistency. Just publicly saying things like, I think that property tax dollars should be used for core services and cultural rec and quality of life should be sales tax funded. Some of the questions I get is, well, then is that consistent throughout our organization? And I think this resolution does help us make that consistent through our organization by saying, yes, with the 1 cent sales tax that's already in place, we utilize the 50% of that. We do utilize that towards quality of life. So I think I've been on record publicly to say that I am supportive of this, because I think this is a consistent approach to saying that property taxes should be used for our core functions and core functions only. I just want to make sure there's enough. I think Commissioner Howell and I are fairly aligned in some of this. I think there's we might be coming at it a little different approach with this as to why I think this is really, really important. But I think for the most part, I do think we're pretty much in line of it. I just want to make sure that there's nothing I'm missing, because I think there are some flexibility. There's ability to be flexible in these things, particularly in those that would be considered infrastructure projects and things of that sort, staffing. So, okay, you did a good job answering my questions. I appreciate it. Commissioner Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. A couple things. As we define quality of life, and one of the highlighted areas says spending on economic development shall not be considered quality of life spending. Well, in a lot of cases, the first four things on the quality of life, I think, are economic development, honestly. If you look at the Sedgwick County Zoo, $80 million worth of impact to the economy every single year. If you look at Exploration Place, once we get the new playscapes, it's $60 to $70 million economic impact to our community. In addition, without those things, how do we recruit the workers that we need to come into our community in order to be able to fill all the jobs that we're creating? So I would take those off quality of life, at least the top four, Sedgwick County Zoo, Exploration Place, the parks, and Intrust Bank Arena, because each and every one of those is an economic development driver. They are critical to what we do here and how we recruit people. So I would pull all four of those off quality of life. Those are critical. In addition, I'm concerned because one of the things that Commissioner Howell said is that, oh, the future commissioners can just change it back because they don't agree with it. Well, that's difficult. That is extremely, extremely difficult. We faced that when a previous commission handcuffed every future commission on putting a mill levy tax lid on us. That was politically difficult to change back. And this would be politically difficult to change back. As Commissioner Howell mentioned, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in the future that's going to affect future commissions. And I see no reason to handcuff a future commission. That's not our job. We went through probably the most difficult budget that I've had in 8 years I've been here for the 2025 budget, but we got through it and we decided what was important and what wasn't important. We disagreed amongst ourselves. We had individuals on this commission that said this is important to them, and others of us disagreed with some of those, but we got a budget at the end that met the needs of our community going forward. Something like this, when the money is fungible, is something that all we're doing is spinning our wheels. We're using semantics and we're not defining the problem the way it needs to be defined. I would give all future commissioners the ability to make up their own minds on what is important to go into the budget when they're sitting down, because that's what they're elected to do. And they can make the decision at that time. It is not my job today sitting here to tell a future commissioner, nope, you can only do it this way because I'm smarter than anybody that's ever going to be elected after I'm gone. Thank you.
Well, with all due respect, thank you, Chair, Commissioner. I would argue there's plenty of money in the sales tax fund to cover these top four. Once again, are we willing to raise property taxes to cover any of these top four? That's really that's the heart of the matter. I would say if we had to raise property taxes to cover these top four items, I think we'd have dire issues within our budget. But
so can I address that?
Well, let me just continue to say I want to be able to tell our constituents, and again, I don't think it's just semantics. But if I tell them we are threatening to take your house away, if you don't pay your taxes, we will take your home away from you and sell it for our own revenue. To me, that is a property right. Something is so important as their home, and take that away basically to reduce to lower the ticket prices at these places, to subsidize. And again, they create revenue. We know they do. All the sales tax comes in from these organizations. But I just think fundamentally the people need to know that property taxes are not going to fund when they have trouble putting food on the table, have trouble paying their electric bill, and they're threatening to lose their home. That those dollars are going to something that's absolutely necessary, and that's where again these are great things to have, but they don't get to that level. And I think that again, there's sales tax revenues to cover these four things. Why not connect those two dots so we can tell honestly our constituents are not using your tax dollars from your home to fund these types of things that they may never get to enjoy them. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Once again, that's a future commission's decision. It is not our decision to make at this time. You're using drama, saying we're going to take away your home. I'm not into drama. I'm into governing this county and allowing the commissioners in the future to govern this county. So talking about raising taxes. Well, say something serious happens to Interest Bank Arena. Are we just going to let that deteriorate? Or are we going to fix it and keep that as something that is a valuable asset to our community? I can't foresee the future. I can't tell you that something's not going to happen or we're going to have a roof replacement and all the chillers go down and we can't put ice down. We can't do a lot of things to the Interest Bank Arena, and we may have to use property tax in order to be able to do that. I'm not going to handicap the future commission. And I see what you're saying, that that's a building. So yes, we are going to have to, but I am not going to go out and beat a drum and use drama to tell the citizens of our community that this is so important that I'm going to take your house away, because future commission is never going to do that. Thank you.
Just to be clear, the resolution says capital improvement spending, and in my opinion, that means taking care of the buildings we already own, shall not be considered quality of life spending. Capital improvement spending on Sedgwick County owned property shall not consider quality of life spending. So if the roof on the Interest Bank Arena needs replaced, or something at the zoo, for example, we have access to revenue that will take care of those problems. And again, I hate to say this, but I think these guardrails, these guidelines are good for commissioners. I'm sorry that you didn't like the previous resolution, but what I did was there was two resolutions. One of them said we had a target mill levy. Rather than using last year's mill levy to build the budget, we would use a target mill levy, and that could have been changed at any time. That was really not a horrible resolution. I look at our time history of our mill levy, and actually I'm very impressed with it, because unlike most other municipalities who saw incremental increases, and then they said we never voted for a mill levy increase. I mean, Wichita is a great example. Their mill levy's gone up by more than 2 mills, yet they claim they never voted for a mill levy increase because they don't have a target. Again, it's a better way of building a budget, and thankfully we've been able to lower the mill levy a couple times since then. But if we'd had a situation where the assessed value growth wasn't actually providing extra money for us to figure out how to spend that money, we used that money to enhance salary for our staff. But had that not happened, we would have had a hard decision to make about whether or not you're willing to raise the mill levy to cover what we think considered to be a very lean budget. You weren't here in 2016 when I was. 2015, when we built the 2016 budget, it was a lot more difficult than the 2025 budget. Let me just say that, because we didn't have the revenue coming in. When our previous manager walked out the door, he handed us basically a index card for a budget recommendation, include some cuts. And we implemented some of those cuts, and Wichita still mad at us about that. The day reporting center was one of those. We talked about for years, and Bill Buchanan thought it was a great idea. Cut the day reporting center. We did that. We got lambasted in the community for that. We ended up cutting a little over $1 million, mostly a lot of that from the health department. And the Eagle said we're going to kill, I forget how many people, 60 people that year, because we didn't have public health. We had a campaign go against the commission for cutting quality of life spending that year. And guess what? What was the raise in 2016? It was like maybe 0 or maybe 1% or 0.5%. It was practically nothing. It was a very small increase in our salary that year. Bill Buchanan walked out the door. I think we were about $8 million underwater. And there wasn't assessed value growth to solve that problem. We had to be conservatives, and we had to find ways to solve that by cuts. Thankfully, this last year we had assessed value growth to cover it. It wasn't that hard of a budget, frankly. Chairman, if this come up for a vote, please work on it with your cabs. Please make recommendations for changes. This will come up for a vote. You're welcome to vote no. You don't want it to pass? Vote no. But I want this to come up for a vote. I want to be on record whether we support this resolution or not. I'm intending to bring this up for a vote at some point soon. Thank you.
And if I could just real quick, Brandy Bailey and I are texting just to follow up on the tax info. We're not seeing high delinquencies right now. And So she's pulling that data. We're also going to look at kind of what foreclosures have looked like over the last few years, because I do think that that narrative is very important about what property taxes are doing to our community. So we'll have, Brandy had already started looking at that. So we'll have some good data for you on that as well.
Thank you.
I would just say that I would like this to go to cab so I can hear from my advisory board on their feelings on it. I struggle with tying the hands of commission, and that's not something just with this, but in anything that we've talked about in my time here, if it's going to tie the hands of commissioners going forward, I've been pretty much against it. So since this really is semantics, I don't know if it's worth going down that path, but I would like to hear what my advisory boards and frankly, what everybody's advisory boards say about this, because it's all in one bucket. So it really doesn't change anything. So that's where I struggle with this. If it was a significant change that we were talking about, I think that would be a different conversation, but this doesn't do that. So I struggle with changing anything at this point.
Thank you. Tom, anything else? Okay. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Lindsay, anything?
I think Commissioner, was today the day you wanted to talk about your, the other thing you alluded to earlier about the property tax, self-imposed property tax lid, to try and get consensus on that?
So let me just introduce another concept. I was in the legislature when they were debating the truth in taxation law, and I was a huge fan. I remember speaking in favor of it and passionately voted for it. All that was, frankly, was transparency to the public, saying, here's what we're doing. Elected officials hated that law. I don't really know why. If you are going to raise back then it was raising the mill levy rate. I don't think it was even the dollars. It was focused on the mill levy rate. If you're going to raise the mill levy rate, it required a couple of extra steps where you had to provide additional notice in the newspaper and actually have a recorded roll call vote, essentially, of the elected officials. It wasn't like it was it was not a painful law for anybody, frankly. But the elected officials across the state complained about that quite a bit. I don't, to this day, I don't understand what their problem was. But I believe it was 2015 or 2014, they replaced that. I think it was 2015. Replaced that with the what we call a tax lid. And the tax lid in cities had, I think, 4 calculations. In the county, it had 3. Ours was basically population growth, new construction, and consumer price index for your region. And that went into a formula, and you can calculate essentially a lid for your municipality. Cities had annexation as well. And there was also a public safety exemption to the tax lid. And because of that exemption, I talked to Jay Hall just the other day about, out of the roughly 600 cities of Sedgwick County and the 100 county and the 600 cities of Kansas, let me say that right, and the 105 counties of our state, how many municipalities over the following 3 or 4 or 5 years actually had trouble, if you will, managing their budgets as a consequence of the tax lid law? I mean, how many of them actually hit, difficulties managing their budgets, and they found it hard to govern, if you will, through lack of revenue because of this law? How many of those even went through the process of having to provide notification and do the actual vote to exceed the lid? The answer he gave me was he thought none. I don't think there was a single municipality over those years that did that. And that's one of the frustrations that the legislature had, was they said, well, the tax lid is so loosey-goosey, it has so many loopholes that it doesn't really provide a cap to anything. And they didn't like the lid as it wasn't really doing anything. And so they replaced that with Senate Bill 13, I think in 2018 or 2019.
Around 2020.
2020. And as you know, Senate Bill 13 provides a revenue neutral rate notification to the taxpayers, notifying them of date and time of public hearings for any municipality wanting to exceed the previous year's property tax collection budget and budgeted property tax collection. That's where we're at today. And I've been following that. I think every large municipality has had not even come close to living under our revenue neutral rate threshold. So I don't think the RNR is working the way that the state legislature anticipated. I think it's frustration, understanding that there's a lot of frustration because there's an expectation that we would live under some previous years' property tax revenue collection. It doesn't make a lot of sense over time. You might get away with that for a year or two. Let me argue, though, if you are going to get away with that for a year or two, that means you've over collected taxes in the past, or you've been truly inefficient and you're finding efficiencies to manage the budget because of inflation. Inflation, everything costs more. And because of that, if you were running a lean organization, you're not over collecting taxes and you're very, very efficient, you don't have opportunities not to exceed the revenue neutral rate unless you cut services. And there lies the problem. So everybody is every large municipality, especially, is exceeding the revenue neutral rate. Some townships and some small counties have been able to live under the revenue neutral rate for a year or two, but it's going to come back. They will exceed it at some point. And again, I would argue they're not necessarily the best governed organizations because they're able to do that. It just demonstrates some bad behavior on their part, if you ask me, my opinion. The idea that the revenue neutral rate should govern us in any way, I don't know that I agree with that. I think the problem with the revenue neutral rate is obvious. The state is so focused on solving property tax issues, I think primarily because it is the most egregious tax to the taxpayers. And since the state collects the standard 21.5 mils, they depend mostly on sales taxes and income taxes for their own spending. And the 21.5 mils, 20 mils of that goes to schools and school formula. They look at themselves as being really not the problem. And so the constituents, our taxpayers, have gone to the legislature saying, do something about local government. They're not being conservative. They're collecting too much money. It's not fair. So they're looking to the legislature to solve the problem. And they come up with all kinds of ideas. And there's more ideas coming. By the way, I've been told the legislature in 2025 session, they plan on having a tax bill to the governor's desk within the first 30 days. I don't even know what that's going to be yet, but that's coming. They plan on doing something to rein us in on our property taxes. So with that, I don't know that constitutionally they can ever limit our ability to levy taxes. They can't ever really constitutionally limit our ability to levy taxes. We have responsibility to govern and to fund things that we believe are right. There's home rule authority in place. So constitutionally, they can never really limit our ability to levy taxes to the degree that we feel like we need those dollars to govern. So they're going to play games. We're going to respond and do what we have to do. Looking back at the tax that happened between 2015 and 2020, I think the biggest problem that they had was the public safety exemption. I don't know why it was exempted. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I would like to see it ourselves have a self-imposed tax lid. And the idea is it would be based primarily on consumer price index. And there's different options of how you do that, rolling averages and where you get your data and when you pull that data. But a consumer price, basically the tax lid that was based on consumer price index, new construction, and population growth makes a lot of sense for the county. And I would rather build a budget based on that without the property tax exemption. Again, it's just a tax lid, it's self-imposed. It doesn't mean we can't exceed that lid. It just tells us how we need to build. It gives us a goal to build a budget to. If we need to exceed that, we have all the authority to exceed that. Nothing stops us from doing that, but it helps us build a budget for something that's not based on the assessed value growth. I don't know if you guys talked to Mark Clark yesterday, but I get the idea that assessed value growth in 2020, the next round of assessed value growth, the next assessed value notifications is going to show a large increase in housing costs yet again. Anybody want to guess what that number is going to be? I'm going to guess 8 or 9% is my guess, maybe more. And so most municipalities under the Senate Bill 13 are going to exceed the revenue neutral rate, and there's nothing to stop them to capturing the full growth. And that's what most municipalities are going to do. They're going to capture the full growth. I would rather have a different way of doing this. I think that the mill levy rate and the assessed value growth are interesting numbers. I don't think either one of them actually have a lot to do with budget construction. I think consumer price index, population growth, and new construction have a lot more to do with the cost of government than the assessed value changes and the previous year's budget. I'm not saying that right. The things we're doing right now are assessed value growth is primarily it. So I think consumer price index is a much better guideline. If we were to ignore the assessed value growth and ignore the mill levy rate and simply just say, whatever the assessed value is, that's really not our problem. It's really not our interest. Our interest is only to build a budget and grow the budget at a rate that gives us some reasonable growth rate that I can defend to taxpayers and say, if consumer price index, if our economy, a local economy went up 4% and we grow our budget by 4%, that's defendable. But we have housing markets that are correcting and going up 8 or 9 or 10%, and we have a 4% consumer price index, and we capture 9%. That's hard to defend that. So I would like to have it's an internal self-imposed guideline to build a budget based on a better policy we had before without the public safety exemption. I think we should explore the idea of doing it that way rather than how we do it under Senate Bill 13. Senate Bill 13, in my opinion, doesn't provide any actual constraint to Sedgwick County because we're never going to be under the R&R. And knowing that, what is our constraint? We're tempted to capture the assessed value growth. Last several years, we've corrected salaries across the entire organization. We've kept most of the money, assessed value growth. We've collected that money and we've addressed wages across the organization, year after year after year. I think this next year, if we were to keep the assessed value growth this next year, I don't think I can defend it any longer. I think we have to find a better way. And so I think the previous lid was better with that one exemption. So I'll stop and I'll answer questions. Thank you.
Chairman, can I make a quick comment?
Please.
Commissioner Howell, you'd raised the point about constitutionally whether the state legislature can cap municipalities' ability to tax. Just off the top of my head, I know the Kansas Constitution sets the taxation rates for different classifications of properties. It also indicates how property is supposed to be uniformly and equally valued with some limited exceptions. But I'm not aware of it limiting within the text of the Kansas Constitution the ability of the legislature to govern how municipalities do that. Now, there may be some home rules. When you get into the statutory analysis, it does become a bit more complex. There is a statute out there, and I can't recall the number of it off the top of my head, that the legislature went in, I think it was in the early 2000s, and specifically said any limitations that the legislature previously set on mill levies for municipalities or taxing subdivisions previously were no longer in place. So I think there is existing state statute that says that the legislature, at least since that law was passed, does not set any caps on at least anything that was done before passage of that statute, that they're not doing that. But I don't know that it's constitutional. That would require additional analysis. I just did want to point out that that may be more of an open question.
Make sure I'm clear. What my comment was is the state cannot tell us not to levy. They cannot tell us not to levy taxes to provide revenue to run our government. That's what they cannot do. We are compelled by law to provide revenue to the sheriff. And if, for example, if they capped us in some way and they said you cannot collect enough revenue to fund the sheriff, I think that goes to court and the sheriff wins. The legislature can't compel us to not levy taxes.
And I think right now, and a lot of that I would probably want to analyze further if we're going to get to a full-on legal opinion. But I do think that right now, statutorily, they probably can't do that anyways. I don't know that it stems from the Kansas Constitution, although I think some of the arguments would certainly lead there. But I think I agree with you in principle, Commissioner.
I think statutorily, though, they have tried to limit us in the past, right? And they require a public vote to supersede that. And
they always allow us a way to get through whatever mechanism we have to go through to actually raise the mill levy or raise revenue as necessary. They've never given us a way not to do those two things.
But they have with the truth in taxation, we would have to go to a public vote. And if the voter said no, then we could not. So I just want to be clear. We have been in that situation before. The truth in taxation applied to the fire district under the old way. And we actually did struggle with that at the time. even, and that was even a special district. Counties are truly political subdivisions of the state. So I do think we would need some clear analysis if we wanted to get into it. I don't know that it becomes germane to this point. I understand what you're trying to get to, but they have limited us in the past. I also, I guess, want to take an opportunity just to mention for this lid, it would be what you're asking for today is for staff work to do analysis to then put together a resolution. Is that correct? Is that clarifying what you wanted from the commission today?
I want us to consider again, this is self-imposed resolution that helps us build a budget by using consumer price index as a guide, our local economy growth as a guide, rather than the Senate bill. Again, we still have to comply with Senate Bill 13 requirements. I'm not suggesting we don't do those things. I'm simply saying that we have before us Senate Bill 13 is one end of the budget spectrum, and assessed value growth with last year's mill levy is the other end. And both of those have problems. Neither one of those is, I think, the right answer for Sedgwick County. And so if we don't have those 2 endpoints, we're not going to pick either one of those. What is our guideline? And I'm suggesting we would use a local economy. The changes in the local economy should drive how we build our budget. That's reasonable. And if you want to build the budget, if the budget grows faster than that, it becomes harder to defend. And I think the taxpayers are asking us to find some way to stop the large increases. And honestly, the last 3 years, we've captured the assessed value growth largely, and we've addressed a lot of challenges within our staff. Our pay across the spectrum has changed drastically. Okay, so we've done some great things, but the question is, if this happens again year after next 2 or 3 years in a row, it becomes non-defensible. I don't know how we're going to say to anybody, what's our guideline on how we build a budget? What is that? And if it's not revenue neutral rate, and if it's not capture the assessed value growth from last year's mill levy, what are we telling the staff? What are we telling ourselves? What do we tell our constituents and our taxpayers? How do we actually build a budget? What's our guideline? We have none. Because the two ends of that spectrum are too high and too low. So we need something that makes sense. And again, I think measuring the local economy, the changes in the local economy is very defensible. By the way, even the state's leading voices on property taxes agree with what I just said. They understand that growing the budget at a rate that is tied to the local economy is defensible. They do not fight us on that. So the policy that we have before us actually doesn't reflect that opportunity to grow the budget at that reasonable rate. So again, since they're not going to give us the policy from statute, we can create it ourselves. If we may not do that, they might hand it to us anyway. Because again, Senate Bill 13 is a flawed law. So next time they touch property taxes, maybe that's what's coming. Is some other way of dealing with this problem. If you want to have local control, I'd say we ought to come up with a policy that makes sense, that's defendable, even to the legislature. And right now, we don't have that.
Okay, thoughts, comments?
That's all we answer.
Okay.
Be clear, can they please develop that for us to take a look at?
Yeah, I actually have some questions on, I'd like to, Lauren around today, I'd like to chat with her a little bit. She's not. I have some questions about.
She's remote, so we can get a Zoom or
Okay,
something together
no,
if you'd like.
okay. What is the process? What kind of workload does that take? What Commissioner Howe is recommending? What is it, a resolution that's being recommended, or is it a?
I know that he plans a resolution, but the analysis would require looking at what would our budget look like today, maybe if we went back 5 years and started with that maybe not that assessed value, but that property tax levy, and look at what applying CPI to that would look like. And then what that would have looked like to the overall revenue coming in, and comparing that to what.
Was there not always, I thought I saw an email and some work already done on that.
So that was based on what Commissioner Howell was describing before, which was that property tax lid that the state had that included the public safety exemptions and some of those things. It also had a slightly different take on what we could factor in. It was a 5-year average of
I see.
CPI and some of that stuff. So it's just going to take a little bit of a different computation.
And the lift to be able to accomplish that?
I honestly don't know. I mean, it's not going to be simple, but it's doable.
Commissioners?
I will add, and Commissioner Howell and I've talked about this in the past. When we go through a retreat this year, just like we did last year, the commission right now has the authority to say how much valuation they want to catch. And if they don't want to catch, if it's 7, 8, 9%, we don't know. But if they don't want to catch that, then just lay that parameter out. Whereas you have the authority now. I think what Commissioner Howell wants to do is resolve that more definitively. But the commission has authority to do that today.
Well, this measurement, whether it's done by resolution or done as an internal guide, do you see value in having this measurement for us to look at, even in building the budget, whether it's in resolution or not in resolution?
So as we've been talking through this, there are some, I haven't even had a chance to tell this to Commissioner Howell yet, so forgive me. But there are some concerns popping up because what's coming to my mind is that long sheet that we do that shows how we perform. So let's say that we do get to where the Fed wants to be and we're at 2% inflation. Well, we know our inmate medical costs go up more than that significantly per year. The contract says anywhere from 3 to 12%. That's a huge part of our budget. Same thing with potentially out of county costs where they're taking the rate from $35 to $65 a day. We know our sheriff's office is on 5% steps. We know our fire and EMS are on 3% steps. We know that we have, at least for now, committed to every other year shifting the pay structure by at least 2%. So that's a 5% raise in those years for significant portions of our load. Then I think about utilities and I think about our capers and our KPNF rates that have gone up far more than inflation over the last several years, even when we had 8 or 9%. And so those are the things that are starting to come to my mind as concerns about using something that looks backward, which is CPI, right? To then try and project a budget that's going to go forward. I'm not as concerned with the last 5 years because we have had such huge increases. But then I also think about our cash funded CIP. And we all saw at that economic outlook conference that PPI index is like off the charts. Our property insurance has like quadrupled over the last few years. Those are the things in my little CFO heart that are kind of hurting.
Yeah.
Thinking through an approach that wouldn't allow us to take into account that public safety exception or some of those things. So that's where my heart.
I have a question, maybe 2 questions, a comment first. I think having that as a guide, whether it's in resolution or not, I think is interesting. I think it's an interesting concept to see where the economy is versus the growth of government. Could you tell me what do you have baked in to where you think every year that we're going to have to guarantee Sedgwick County government grows X amount because of all the factors that you just listed out?
So what we have in the forecast is not necessarily what we really think value is going to do, right? We have included in the forecast the values that we think you all will allow us to capture. And that's anywhere from 4 to 5% over the life of the forecast. So we have a flat mill levy rate, again, because it all comes back to revenue neutral rate. And what are we publishing? And we never want to show that this commission intends to increase the mill levy rate. So we learned our lesson from that the first year. Not the technical, we'll go with whatever the technically adjusted rate is. But then we know that even if 9 or 10% comes in as the number for residential, which of course, then there's the commercial, there's the personal property, which we know is continuing to decline. There's the state assessed utilities, which are volatile. So all of those components go into assessed value. But we would not plan on you all capturing that. We have heard that message loud and clear. And so we are trying to go with what we think a reasonable capture is. It's still even less than what it used to be. Our average assessed value growth used to be 5.5%. And we would plan for that in our forecasting and our budgets. We don't think that that's what this commission is going to be comfortable with. So we're trying to be responsive, not necessarily with a resolution, but whatever the commission tells us to do, we'll do. But that's what we're doing today.
Okay. I want to have some follow-up discussions. That way I better understand everything that we're working through. And Tom?
It sounds fine.
Okay. A second request. I do think that I'd like the public to know kind of where we're at with Interest Bank Arena. I think when we talk about quality of life stuff, we talk frequently about the zoo and Exploration Place. And I think that I think the community's probably do an update in a staff meeting setting. Maybe a BOCC meeting of not just where we're at now with that available fund, but also where you think this is going and that there will likely be support needed for Interest Bank Arena in the future. I think the public needs to be aware.
If I could just quickly tell you, in your last monthly, we're down to about 1.9 million as a balance in that fund. And unfortunately, with some of the shows that have canceled this year and then just touring schedules, we've seen a lot of stadium tours, not as many arena tours. We are not expecting to add any operating income to the fund this year. We do know that we'll get facility fee revenue. That was $300,000 last year. So that certainly helps. October 1st was their deadline to submit a CIP, and it's about $1 million for next year. There's also going to be emergency repairs coming. So because there is now this 1 year where we're not expecting operating income, that has changed a little bit of the dynamic of the fund. So we'll be happy to come and give an update publicly on what that looks like and maybe have AJ there to talk about what he sees.
Yeah, in the future. Okay, good. Okay, Tom. We're good. Okay. See everybody tomorrow morning.